The Indiana sky was a brilliant azure, not a single cloud darkening the heavenly dome. In the branches of the trees, birds sang among the budding leaves, and crocuses, daffodils, and narcissus bloomed. It seemed as if all of nature had joined together in some sinister conspiracy to laugh at my sadness. I got into the back seat of my son's car and we drove slowly out of the cemetery. Sally turned around in her seat and looked at me sympathetically. She reached across the seat and squeezed my palm. "That was a beautiful ceremony, Mr. Moore. I know Madeline would have loved it." I didn't say anything back. Maddie was a happy, nature-loving person, or at least she had been until Grace left. Terry looked back at me and I could see his eyes were reddening too, but he was trying his best to be supportive. "Sally's right, Dad. Mom would want it to be like it was today." I knew they were right. Spring was Maddie's favorite time of year. I think if she had to go away, it would be the time she would choose. But that's faint consolation when you've just buried the wife you loved for 35 years. Terry parked in front of our house, and he and Sally made their way into the house. I sank heavily onto the couch. They looked at me anxiously. "Have you heard anything about Grace?" I asked. Terry looked at the floor. "No, not a word." I nodded. I was sure of the answer, but I couldn't resist asking. In the silence that ensued, Terry stirred restlessly and then asked, "Are you going to be okay, Dad?" How do you answer that? I asked myself. Nothing will ever be okay, but I can't tell my son that. It would only increase his anxiety for me, and he has his own grief to deal with. "I'll be fine," I told him. "It's going to be pretty weird living here without her, but I plan on being busy, and that will help." "That's good, Dad," Terry replied. "Look, we need to get Lance away from the babysitter. But if you need anything at all, please call me." Getting up to see them off, I nodded. "You two will take good care of my grandson," I told them. As they left, I stood looking at the house Maddie and I had shared for so many years. It was filled with memories, some good, others not so good. But it had always been filled with life, and now, not so much. It was still bright outside, but the light coming through the windows seemed to lose its intensity as it made its way inside. I sat back down and began to indulge in my memories. My thoughts went back to when we bought this house all those years ago. Truth be told, it was too big and expensive for a young couple just starting out. But we fell in love with the place as soon as we saw it, and there was nothing left for us to do. We pulled all our savings out of the bank, and my father lent me enough money for the down payment. But even then, the monthly payment was more than I could safely handle, so Maddie went looking for a job. She was lucky and found one in the development department of the city's art museum. She had always been good at communication, both written and verbal, and with her love of art, it was perfect. I guess you could say we were poor. We had very little money left over each month after paying the mortgage and utilities. But we didn't care. We were madly in love and on our way to the American dream. We may not have been able to go out to dinner and a movie, but we made up for it. Not surprisingly, Maddie got pregnant with Terry the second year after we settled into our new home. It was a difficult labor. Maddie was in labor for 18 hours, but then we had this wonderful new life in our arms and everything was wonderful. Terry was a good baby. He slept through the night for 6 weeks. He didn't have colic or the problems that many newborns have. As he grew, he continued to show the same good health and happy disposition, so much so that Maddie was not afraid to return to work when Terry was 9 months old. The museum spoke so well of her that they kept her on the job, so the transition went smoothly. Having an infant in the house certainly limited our personal life, but only somewhat. We still made love often once Terry started sleeping through the night, and whenever Maddie had to go on one of her trips to other cities to raise funds, she would come home in a frenzy. I knew I wouldn't get much sleep the first night she returned. Terry came fairly early in our marriage, but the next one was still 5 years away. Maddie wanted to wait. Part of her decision was based on the success she was having at her job. She had been promoted to head of development by then, and she loved everything about it. Working with crowdfunding donors, planning fundraising events, and running an annual fundraising campaign. But I also think Terry's labor was so scary that she just wasn't ready to go through it again anytime soon. Truth be told, we didn't even try when Maddie got pregnant. But as every gynecologist knows, babies are born when they want to be born, regardless of their parents' intentions. And so Grace was born almost exactly 5 years after Terry. But unlike her brother, And despite her name, Grace was a challenge from birth. She cried when she was born and never seemed to stop, except for sleep, which came occasionally and briefly. We were secretly proud of how well Terry was doing and what an easy baby he was. Grace humbled us. She cried. She expectorated. She had diarrhea, and then she cried some more. Many times we were on the verge of a breakdown, but somehow managed it, keeping our sanity and marriage intact. I think Maddie had it harder than I did. For some reason, Grace seemed to behave better. It doesn't get any better than that. When I held her in my arms, fed her, or changed her clothes. But when Maddie picked her up, baby Grace fought, cried, and generally behaved the worst. She was almost 9 months old before she started sleeping through the night. The pediatrician told us that some babies are just more difficult than others. If that was true, Grace should have been the model of a difficult child. As she grew older, we realized that her personality was very different from her brother's. Whereas Terry was quiet and quickly immersed in his own affairs, Grace was constantly active, often switching from one thing to another, demanding attention and distracted by something else. When she turned 2, we learned the true meaning of the terrible 2. Worse, it seemed that she would not grow out of this stage, even when she turned 3 or more. No became her favorite word, and she proved to be both willful and inflexible. "Are you sure we brought the right baby home from the birth center?" Maddie would ask me in the evenings when Grace proved unusually difficult. Another striking difference between our two children was their performance in school. From the very beginning, Terry demonstrated the need to achieve that is often inherent in firstborn children. As my father used to say, he treated school like a pig to dirt. He wasn't a genius, but he studied well, always diligently, and all the teachers praised him when we went to parent-teacher conferences. Grace, on the other hand, was an indifferent student. This is not to say that she was slow. In fact, she was very intelligent, perhaps in some respects even more intelligent than Terry. If a subject interested her, she gave herself to it unreservedly, often getting the highest grade in the class. But she had neither interest nor patience for subjects she disliked, and it was almost impossible to get her to devote time and energy to them. As a result, she excelled in some areas but failed in all others, drastically lowering her overall academic performance. Maddie and I dreaded the moment when Grace would reach adolescence, and our fears were well-founded. The rebelliousness and independence that had blazed in her as a child turned into a raging flame when she turned 13, and it had gotten worse ever since. She acted defiant, sassy, and often disobeyed. Once, when we were punishing her at 16, she slipped out of her room, took one of our cars without permission, and went out drinking and dancing with her friends. When she got home at 3 in the morning, she was so drunk she could barely stand on her feet, but she somehow managed to get the car and herself home safely. I guess the Lord really does look out for drunks, fools, and children. Anyway, Grace made it to graduation, and while she certainly didn't excel in her studies, she still received her high school diploma. The diploma wouldn't help her get into Harvard, but at least she had the opportunity to go to community college and possibly transfer to a better school after her sophomore year. At least that was our plan. But her successes lulled us into a false sense of optimism. Shortly after graduation, Grace and her mother had a big fight. I wasn't around when it started, so I don't know who threw the first verbal blow, but I heard yelling and entered the room just in time to hear Maddie screaming, "I am your mother, and I will not tolerate this lack of respect on your part, young lady." To which my daughter responded with an equally loud, "You're not my mother, you're a bitch." Maddie and I were stunned, but before either of us could react, Grace burst into tears and ran up the stairs to her room. I heard the door slam, but when I tried the knob, it was locked. I knew I could open her door with the master key, but I figured it was better to hold off than to get into a fight right away. Now I wished I'd chosen the other option. We didn't see Grace for the rest of the day, which was good because Maddie was almost hysterical. I had to put all my energy into comforting and calming her down as best I could. Grace didn't show up for dinner, so we figured she was on the phone with her girlfriends about how badly her parents were treating her. After the stolen car episode, I made it a rule to keep all the car keys in our room and check them before bed. I didn't sleep well and got up twice during the night to make sure Grace was still there. Sometime after midnight, I fell into an uneasy sleep. When I finally woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was walk down the hall and check Grace's room. Relieved to see that her door was still closed, I turned to go back to our bedroom. But something made me double check, and when I tried the doorknob, it swung open. Her room was as chaotic as it always was, but Grace wasn't in her bed. I quickly ran downstairs and checked the rest of the house. Grace wasn't there. Then I went out to the garage to make sure the cars were still there. They were in place. I went back into the house, about to wake Maddie up and tell her what I had discovered, when I suddenly noticed my wallet on the table in the breakfast room. I was sure I had left it on the dresser the night before. Opening it, I discovered two things. I had withdrawn $500 from the bank earlier in the week, and now it was gone. Then I saw a note folded where the bills had been. I recognized Grace's scribbles. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I took the money. I'll pay you back someday." I quickly grabbed my phone and called the police. "I want to report a missing person," I told the sergeant. He wanted to know her age and how long she had been missing. When I told him she was 18 and had only been gone for a few hours, he tiredly explained that A, she was an adult and could come and go as she pleased, and B, in any case, she couldn't be considered missing if she had been gone for more than 24 hours unless there was evidence of a crime. I decided not to mention the money Grace had taken. In the midst of my conversation, Maddie came downstairs and, catching the gist of the discussion, began tugging frantically at my sleeve, trying to find out what was the matter. I pulled out a note from Grace and held it out to her. When she read it, she burst into tears. I turned back to the phone again. "Look, Sarge, I don't know if you have a child or not, but if you did and he or she ran away like that, what would you do?" There was a pause, and his voice lost its dullness and became human. "The first thing I'd do would be to call all her friends and see if any of them knew where she might have gone. If that doesn't yield anything, I'd check the bus terminal to see if she caught any buses. A lot of fugitives do that because it's cheap and no hassle on the way. And if you haven't already done so, try calling her cell phone. If she doesn't answer, leave her a message. That's what I would do." I thanked him and hung up. I wondered if he could have a child Grace's age. I called Grace's cell phone, and it went straight to voicemail. "Grace," I said as calmly as I could under the circumstances, "please come home. I'm so scared for you, baby girl. If you can't come home, I'll come get you wherever you are. If you don't want to come home, at least call and let us know you're okay. Please, baby. Mommy and I love you so much, and we're so scared, baby. Please." Maddie and I started calling all of Grace's friends we could remember. No one knew where she might have gone, and even if they did, no one would admit it. We called Terry, who by then had graduated from college and had a wife of his own, but we hadn't heard from him either. Terry and Grace were not close, but they were closer to each other than she was to us. He promised to let us know immediately if he had any news. Then we drove to the bus station, hoping she was still there. But she wasn't, and none of the people at the ticket booths remembered selling a one-way ticket to an 18-year-old girl. The next few days turned into a nightmare. After the allotted 24 hours, we officially reported Grace missing. The police warned us that they couldn't force her to return home since she was of legal age, but promised to find her nonetheless. We learned about the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and registered Grace with it. We learned about support groups made up of parents of missing children. We were horrified to learn that about 850,000 new names are added to the list of missing children every year, nearly 2/3 of them children under 20. But we also learned that almost as many names are removed each year as people return home or are otherwise removed from the list. That gave us hope. I contacted a detective agency to see if they could help. The agent I spoke with was very sympathetic, but not very reassuring. Indianapolis is surrounded by major cities within a several hundred-mile radius in all directions, and each has a significant number of runaways and homeless people where she could disappear. Even if we knew where she'd gone, we'd have a hard time tracking her down if she doesn't want to be found. I'll be honest with you, we don't like taking on cases like this because we're so rarely lucky. If I were you, I'd keep doing what you're doing now. The chances of you finding her that way are as good as any of us. I left his office alarmed and discouraged. About 2 months after Grace's disappearance, I was working in my office when my cell phone rang. "Hello," I answered, but all I heard was an irritated female voice. "Daddy?" "Grace," I called out. "Where are you, baby? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Daddy," she replied. "I'm in a safe place. I just don't want you to worry about me." "Come home, Grace," I pleaded. "Or tell me where you are and I'll come get you." "No, I can't, Daddy," she said. "It's all too strange. I'll stay where I am." "Oh, baby, please come home. Mommy and I miss you so much." "I'm sorry, Daddy, I can't. Look, I just wanted you to know that I'm okay, and you don't have to worry about me. I'll call you again when I can." And with those words, she left. I left work and drove to the museum to see Maddie. I didn't trust myself to tell her over the phone. When I walked into her office, Maddie saw me and pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes widening with fear. "No, it's good news," I said hastily. "I just got a call from Grace." At those words, Maddie put her head down on the table and began to sob. I walked over and hugged her. When she pulled herself together, I told her what had happened and what Grace had said. "But when is she coming home?" Maddie asked. "She has to come home." I sighed. "Honey, she said she was in a safe place and she's going to stay there for now. She said it's too weird for her to come home right now." Maddie started crying again. "She hates me," she sobbed. "I drove her away and now she's punishing me." "No, honey, no. She's confused and unhappy, and none of us know what's really going on with her. You have to stop berating yourself. That argument you had with her wasn't the reason she left. It was just a symptom of her confusion. You have to believe that." I don't think Maddie believed my hypothesis, but she calmed down, and the two of us were able to take comfort in the fact that our daughter was alive and seemed to be okay. This shaped the rest of my life. Every few months, Grace would call me and assure me that she was fine. She never asked for money, never told me where she was, and never agreed to come home, no matter how much I begged. From time to time, Terry would let me know that she had called him, and always with a similar message. But she never called Maddie, and although I tried to downplay the obvious, I knew that Maddie was always offended that our daughter wouldn't talk to her. We never reconciled this situation, but after a few years, we did come to some agreement. Our daughter didn't want us in her life, and there was nothing we could do about it. We still worried about her, especially when the gaps between calls dragged on longer than usual, but no matter where she was or what she was doing, she was safe as far as we could tell, and we clung to that belief for the sake of our own mental health. But our comparative tranquility did not last long. A new threat arose. One day, Maddie came home from a routine mammogram with disturbing news. The doctor had discovered a tumor. "He wants me to do a biopsy," she told me. I felt a clammy sweat break out even as I tried to reassure her. "It's probably nothing, honey. They have to check everything for protection these days. You'll see," I told her, hugging her. But I don't think she believed my words any more than I did myself. Somehow Maddie and I had turned into characters in an ancient Greek tragedy, and the gods seemed to be in a particularly vengeful mood. My sense of doom intensified when we got the results back from the pathology lab. The tumor was malignant, with poorly differentiated cancer cells. Further examination revealed that the cancer had spread to the lymphatic system. I was devastated, but knew I had to be strong for Maddie because she would need all the strength she could get. "We will fight this disease," I told her. "It's not a death sentence. Many women go through it and live happily ever after." Maddie's oncologist was an uncompromising person. "We're going to treat this aggressively," he told us. "I don't want to take a gradual approach and risk this thing getting away from us." When we learned what the word aggressive meant, Maddie turned pale, and I thought I was going to pass out for a moment. She was facing a mastectomy and lymph node removal, followed by chemotherapy and radiation. We both cried when we got home from the doctor's office, and I cried again when I had to call Terry to let him know. The next act of our little drama had scenes of darkness and light. The light came from the support groups we joined and the support of our friends. Empathy and understanding helped us hang in there and keep our spirits up. But the surgery and subsequent treatment was very grim. But when the gods are angry with mortals, they cannot be appeased by acts of courage and displays of optimism. When we learned that the cancer had metastasized to other organs, Maddie lost the will to fight. "I don't want to go through any more surgeries," she told me. "I don't want to go through any more chemotherapy or radiation. I'm done." I begged and pleaded with her not to give up, but she was adamant, and I couldn't blame her. I saw how weak she was after the surgery, how nauseous she was from the toxic chemicals they injected into her body. No one could blame her for not wanting to keep going through this with very little chance of success. I thought there might be another factor here, although I didn't want to mention it. I was afraid that Maddie saw her cancer as a kind of punishment for what had happened to Grace. Maddie had never said anything like that, but I couldn't help but wonder if that was part of the reason she was refusing further treatment. Once we stopped treatment, things started to change quickly. Maddie had good days when she seemed almost normal. I remember taking her to a flower show and marveling at how much pleasure she took in looking at the many colors. Other days, she could barely lift her head, and I could see her strength drain away like water from a cracked glass. In the last few days, I moved her into hospice care. Most of the time, she just slept. Restless, troubled sleep. When she woke up, she wanted to say something, but she didn't have the energy for long conversations. "Raleigh, you know I've always loved you," she told me more than once. This grieved me, for I had always known it. There was no reason why she should find it necessary to assure me of it all the time. But I only answered that I knew it, and that I had always loved her just as much. On her last day, she came to her senses again and took my hand. "Grace?" was all she said, but I knew what she was asking. All I had to do was shake my head. "Tell her I'm sorry about everything," she mumbled, and drifted back into sleep. She didn't wake up. Later that night, she had an attack of Cheney-Stokes breathing, and then she was gone. The gods had taken their revenge. I came out of my reverie and looked around our quiet house. Now that she was safely buried, there was nothing more I could do for her. It was time to move on. Those were brave words, but they didn't fit my mood. There were times when I wondered how I would move on after losing the two most important women in my life. But it was only self-pity. I had a son and his wife and a son of my own. I knew they loved and needed me as much as I needed them. Life may have lost its zest, but I had no right to think about giving up. The next few weeks were filled with a new batch of pain and discomfort. The pain involved having to put away Maddie's things, especially her clothes, makeup, and other personal items. I knew I had to do it. I didn't want them to become a pathetic, dusty shrine. But each thing I packed held many memories, and it took me several days to complete this relatively simple task. The friends, acquaintances, and coworkers I interacted with over the next few weeks actively and passively showered me with insults. The museum where she worked sent a delegation to offer condolences, and while I appreciated the gesture, I hardly knew these people. The calligraphy-signed memorial they handed me was embarrassing. What was I supposed to do with it, hang it over the fireplace? Many of our friends stopped by to check on me, but didn't know what to say to me other than the trite phrases everyone uses. Likewise, I didn't know what to say in response other than equally trite answers. Worst of all were the people who couldn't think of what to say and, embarrassed, avoided me. I saw them shake their heads or cast concerned glances in my direction when they thought I wouldn't notice. I didn't blame them. Sometimes there's just nothing to say. During Maddie's illness, I had started visiting our minister at church, and now that she was gone, I realized I needed to keep going there. Our minister was a wise and sweet woman who allowed me to pour out my grief in her small office over a cup of tea. In addition to spiritual comfort, she proved to be very insightful about human nature. It was she, more than anyone else, who helped me overcome my self-pity. But when I went to see her this Friday, I had a new problem that both bothered and shamed me. After she poured me a cup and reclined in her swivel chair, I began to make an informal confession. I had a nightmare last night. I dreamed that Maddie was alive, but she wouldn't come to me. I was lying in my bed, but I was helpless and couldn't get up. Maddie just laughed at me and walked out the door without even looking back. I was so mad at her that at that moment I felt like I hated her. I looked up at the Rev's pensive face. What is wrong with me? How can I have these feelings? She took a sip from her cup and looked at me intently. "Riley, what you're feeling is perfectly normal. No one likes to talk about it, but I would hazard a guess that most people who have lost loved ones feel resentment and anger toward them at one time or another." "But how can that be?" I asked. "She's dead, for God's sake, and I'm still alive. She must be resentful of me, not the other way around." "But don't you realize," she said quietly, "she left you alone with all your pain and sorrow. The more you loved her, the more you miss her, and the more it hurts. And the source of that pain is Maddie. Is it any wonder that you feel resentment toward the person who makes you grieve and suffer so terribly?" There was some twisted meaning in her words, but I still felt uneasy. What can I do to make this go away? I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating my dead wife. The priest smiled slightly. "You don't have to worry about that, Riley. The reason for your anger is because you still haven't come to terms with the fact that Maddie is gone. It's all still too fresh and raw. Once you come to terms with it, you'll find that the anger is gone too, and you'll be able to focus on the good memories. Walking out of her office, I hoped she was right. It was very frustrating to discover that I hated the woman I had cherished for so many years. I was glad I had an appointment with our minister that day, because I was invited to dinner with Terry and his family that evening. The last thing I wanted to do was go to visit them with unresolved anger in my heart. Little did I realize that the next scene in my drama was just beginning. After dinner, Terry and I sat in the living room. Sally hadn't left us alone, saying she needed to put their son Lance to bed. "What's the matter, Terry?" I asked him. "I can see you have something you want to tell me." He shifted nervously in his chair and cleared his throat. "It's Grace," he said. "I've heard from her." Instantly, all the anger that the priest had managed to contain during the day spilled back out, but this time it was directed at a new target. "Did you tell her?" I demanded. "Did you tell her her mother was dead?" He looked at me restlessly. "Yes, Daddy, I told her." "And what did she say?" I asked louder than I intended. "She knew Maddie was dying. Couldn't she even make it to her mother's funeral?" "She cried when I told her," Terry replied. I looked at him expectantly. "That's not all, is it?" I asked. His face took on a guilty expression. "She made me swear I wouldn't tell you, Dad, but I can't keep my promise. I know where she is." I sat stunned. After 5 long years, Terry continued. "When I told her about Mom's death, she asked me to send her some of Mom's things that she could keep. I took one of Mom's crosses from the things you gave Sally and sent it to her. Dad, she lives in Chicago. I have her address." He held out a piece of paper to me. "Oh, and she lives under Mom's maiden name. She's Grace Campbell now." And I took the piece of paper with her name and address and saw that Grace did indeed live in Skokie, just north of Chicago. I put the address in my pocket and stood up. "Dad, what are you going to do?" Terry asked in alarm. "There's only one thing I can do," I told him. "I must go and see her." He looked at me in disgust. "I knew you'd say that." He walked me to the door. "Dad, don't do anything crazy." I looked at him triumphantly. "I promise, son." As soon as I got home, I booked a motel near Grace's address. Then, I headed to bed. It was about a 3-hour drive from our house to Chicago, and I wanted to get an early start. I didn't know how long I would be there, so I wasn't sure how much stuff to pack. Along the way, I kept thinking about what I wanted to say to her. After 5 years and everything that had happened in that time, I didn't know where to start. I ran through various scenarios in my head. None of them seemed right. There was too much I didn't know. By the time I got to Skokie, it was past noon, and I decided to grab a bite to eat before heading to her address. I wasn't really that hungry, but I knew that the acid that had built up in my stomach would make a hole in its walls if I didn't put something in there to absorb it. When I got to her address, I was surprised. I was expecting to see a slum, but instead I found myself parked in front of a beautiful complex filled with what appeared to be high-end townhouses. I was so stunned that when I got to the door and rang the bell, I forgot about the speech I had intended to give in front of it. Her eyes watched me through the peephole of the door, and there was a long pause before it opened. Standing in the doorway was my long-lost daughter. She had grown from a frail teenager into a beautiful young woman as tall as her mother. She stood looking at me with a sour expression. "I should have known not to trust Terry," was all she said. At that moment, rage boiled up inside me, which I tried to suppress, and it cost me a lot of effort not to yell at her. Trying to pull myself together, I asked rather sharply, "Is that any way to greet your father after disappearing for 5 years?" She sighed. "You're right, Daddy. I'm sorry. Please come in." She stepped back, opening the door wide, and I entered her house. Everything was tastefully decorated and the furniture seemed fairly new. The sight of her abode raised even more questions for me. What does she do for a living? How was she able to afford such a nice place to live? What had she been doing all those 5 long years she had been away? She invited me over to the couch and sat down in the chair across from me herself. As I looked at her, it struck me again how much she resembled her mother, and at that memory all my resentment and anger burst out again. "Why didn't you come home for your mother's funeral?" I demanded. I demanded. She looked at me helplessly. "Dad, I just couldn't. It was so complicated, I just couldn't." "That's unacceptable," I said. "She was your mother, for God's sake." Grace just sat there with her eyes down. I tried to regain my composure. She was so anxious to see you, I said more gently. Do you know what her last words were? She said, "Tell Grace I'm sorry." I angrily brushed away the tears that seemed to have appeared on my cheeks. I don't know what you were fighting about, but it can't be that it was so bad that you didn't even come to see her being laid to rest. Tears were running down her cheeks, too. But I couldn't, she said hopelessly. If I went back, it would mean I had forgiven her. How could I have done that? Forgiven her for what? I asked. For the way she treated you, she snapped back. I don't know what you're talking about, I said angrily. Your mother loved me and took care of me every day of our 35 years together. Even when she was dying, she told me so over and over again. I could see the anger rising in Grace's eyes, and it reminded me of the good old days when she was a rebellious teenager. Maybe so, Daddy, but she had a funny way of showing it. I could only shake my head. I don't understand a word you're saying, I mumbled back. She gasped, and then the words came out. Daddy, she was cheating on you. Didn't you know about it? Didn't you at least suspect it? I leaned back heavily in my chair. It was getting hard for me to breathe. Said, No, that can't be true. Maddie would never do that. How can you say that? But there was no conviction in my words. Doubt grew in me, even as I protested. It's true, Daddy. I heard her talking to him on the phone. I skipped school once, and when Mom came in, she didn't know I was home. Maybe she needed to change for some important event at the museum, but either way, her phone rang and it was him. I could hear her talking to him as she walked around the bedroom, pulling out the clothes she wanted to wear. She was talking about what they were going to do that night, and then she started talking about what she was going to do to him. She snorted. I was shocked by the scene Grace was retelling to me and grasped at any straw I could find. Maybe it was a joke, honey. Maybe she was just teasing him. But Grace had broken her self-imposed vow of silence, and now everything was going to come out. She interrupted my musings. No, Daddy, it wasn't a joke. I know because the next day when she rebuked me for something, I contradicted her. She tried to deny it, but when I started repeating what she had said to him, she had to admit it. I don't know why, maybe she was tired of living with the guilt. But she told me everything. Who he was, how long ago it had been, how it all started. Then the determined look on her face seemed to dissolve, and the tears began to flow again. And when she was done, she told me that I could never tell anyone about it. Not Terry, not my friends, much less you. She told me you'd never accept it, that you'd divorce her and ruin our home. I couldn't do that, Dad. I couldn't be the one to divide our family. With those words, she covered her face with her hands and began to sob. Despite my own anguish, I went over and knelt down next to her chair to hug her. But I could not remain silent. What she told me raised many more questions. What happened after that? I asked quietly. I tried to keep her secret, Daddy, and I succeeded. Probably for a couple months. I had to finish school and I just wanted to finish it. She looked up at me. But it was so hard. Every time she kissed you, all I could think about was what she told him she was going to do with her mouth. Every time she had some event at the museum, I wondered if it was just an excuse to see him again. And every time she rebuked me for my actions, all I could think was, who are you to judge me? She took a tissue and blew her nose. I felt so bad I thought I was going to explode. And then one day, when she really got to me, I did. That's when you got in a fight with us. I knew I couldn't stay there another day. I couldn't stay with my mom because I couldn't stand her lies and her I'm above it all attitude. And I couldn't stay with you because I knew I couldn't hide everything from you and it would be the end of our family. The only way out was to get as far away as possible. She shrugged. And that's when I ran away to Chicago. Questions swarmed in my head, but the first one that came out of my mouth was, why did you go to Chicago? She looked at me like I was stupid. Because that's where he lives. Who? Where who lives? I said indignantly. The guy she slept with. You've heard of him, Daddy. Carlton Morrison. Suddenly, everything fell into place. I had never met Carlton Morrison, but I knew who he was. He was a wealthy commodities trader who was as famous for the stars he dated as he was for his philanthropy. I remembered that his first multi-million-dollar donation to the museum had been one of Maddie's first fortunes that had made her a rising star in the development department. Now I wondered what she had to do to get it. And then another memory popped into my head. When we were struggling financially, we had a stroke of luck that helped us turn the tide. Maddie came home one day and told me that an aunt I had never met had died and left her a good amount of money. It was enough to get out of debt and stay afloat financially. Now I was left to wonder, who was the real source of that money? But it can't be, I thought. It was so long ago. I tried to remember when it all happened. So their affair started. But no sooner had I remembered than my memories were interrupted by a stirring coming from the back of the house. Grace stood up, stunned. Oh my God, we woke her up. Then she disappeared down a distant hallway. When she reappeared, she was accompanied by a beautiful little girl who must have been about 2 or 3 years old. She had gorgeous brown hair with bangs that went down over her forehead and big brown eyes. But all I could focus on at that moment was her abnormally large elbows, the awkward angle of her lower limbs and feet, and how difficult it was for her to walk, even with the help of her mother. I knelt down and held out my arms to her. Hi, I said quietly. I'm your grandfather. What's your name? Those big eyes stared at me for a moment. Then she said in an interrupted voice, Susie. Hi, Susie, can I give you a hug? She looked over to see her mom smiling and nodding, then held out her arms to me. I gently took her in my arms and stood up, holding my granddaughter in my arms. Looking over her shoulder, I looked at Grace with eyes full of happiness. Why didn't you tell me? It was time for Susie to eat, and I helped Grace feed her as best I could. After that, the girl wanted to go outside, so Grace got the stroller and put her in it. Then we walked down the sun-drenched sidewalk under the trees until we reached a small park. Susie cooed and talked to herself most of the way. There was a playground in one part of the park, and we watched half a dozen kids playing on one of those slides that went down in a spiral. One by one, they would climb to the top of the ladder and then let go and roll down the spiral until they were on the ground. Just like me, I thought wryly. As we strolled along, I pointed with a questioning expression at the precious little girl in front of us. Grace realized. It's cerebral palsy, she told me quietly. I nodded. I didn't know much about cerebral palsy, but I realized that Susie would need special care for the rest of her life. I hugged my daughter. I'm so sorry, baby. You don't need to be sorry, she replied evenly. She's my daughter and my responsibility. I have everything under control. I looked at her questioningly, but she looked confident. Anger flared up inside me again, but I didn't want to alarm Susie, so I tried to speak softer. The least you could do was let me know that I now have a granddaughter. Grace looked at me sadly and then led us to a park bench. She and I sat side by side, and she gently rolled Susie's stroller back and forth. The combination of the sun and the motion of the stroller seemed to lull Susie to sleep. After checking on her daughter's condition, Grace turned to me and said with a gentle expression on her face, Poor Daddy, you just don't understand. Susie is not your granddaughter. Of course she is my granddaughter, I said indignantly. You're my daughter and she's your daughter, so I'm her grandfather. She gently took my hand. You're my daddy. You'll always be my daddy, but you're not my daddy. There was a roar in my ears, or maybe it was the distant sound of the gods laughing. This can't be happening, I gasped. I was there when you were born. I stopped myself. Grace shook her head sadly. I'm so sorry, Daddy. I saw the DNA test. That's when I broke down and cried. Finding my daughter after all this time and losing her again was too hard for me. We must have been a strange picture. An elderly man hunched over, crying bitterly. A young woman putting her arm around his shoulders and trying to comfort him. A baby napping in a stroller. I tried to pull myself together, but I still couldn't think clearly. But if I'm not your real father, then who is? Grace just looked at me, and all the pieces suddenly came together. When did you find out? I asked. Oh, not later, she replied. This surprised me, but then Susie hissed. We really need to get her home, Grace said, and we headed back out. We didn't talk. I still had questions, but my distress was too great to ask them right now. It was clear to me now, Maddie was not the protagonist of this little tragedy. It was me. I was the one being tormented by the gods, taking one blow after another. I remembered an oft-quoted phrase, whom the gods wish to destroy, they first drive mad. I could understand it. I felt like I was clinging to common sense with my fingertips. Grace made us a simple supper, and I helped her feed Susie again. After eating, I held the little cutie in my lap and read to her from one of her favorite books. She enthusiastically pointed to the pictures, and I read the words on the pages. After putting the little girl to bed, Grace and I returned to the living room. The time with Susie had given me a brief respite from my mental turmoil, but now I needed answers to my questions. I wanted to know what had happened to Grace in the 5 years she had been away. Tell me again why you ran away to Chicago, I began. It was simple, Dad. I came here because I wanted to see him, to come face to face with the man who ruined my life and threatened to destroy my family. I had to find out what kind of man could have made Mom do what she did. So what happened? I asked. Well, it was easy to find him. Everyone knew where Carlton Morrison lived. So I just walked up to his mansion and demanded to see him. And when I told him I was Maddie Moore's daughter, he let me in. And what did he say? Oh, he readily admitted that he'd been having an affair with Mom for years. He even said he hoped it would continue. He showed absolutely no remorse. I wanted to claw his eyes out. She sighed. But then he started asking about me, why I'd come, what my plans were. When I admitted I didn't have any plans, he offered to let me stay in one of the rooms in his mansion. He said that if I needed money, he would pay me to do various jobs for him. So I thought, why not? I had nowhere to go, and he owed me for the hell he put me through. Besides, I figured being around him would give me a better understanding of why Mom cheated on him. I shook my head. It's so hard for me to imagine, I told her. You living in the house of your worst enemy. She smiled bitterly. I know, Papa, but you must realize that he is a very persuasive man. He knows how to flatter and joke with you until you do what he wants. It doesn't surprise me that he manages to date all those models and starlets. Even without his fortune, he's a charming companion. She lowered her eyes for a second. Dad, I didn't immediately realize how possible it was to seduce Mom. He has such a knack for getting you talking about something that, after a while, you think it was your idea, and then he just tells you what a clever girl you are for suggesting it. Her face darkened, and now she wasn't looking at me. Dad, I don't know if you know this, but I always thought Mom and I were in competition with each other. This was no surprise to me. I noticed that even though Maddie and Grace fought each other like street cats, Grace always tried to imitate her mother. And when Maddie noticed Grace's efforts, she would try to outdo her at one thing or another. Oh yeah, I noticed the mother-daughter rivalry. Grace still wasn't looking at me. At first I wanted to find out what kind of man was capable of seducing my mother. But after a while, I wondered what she did to seduce a man who could get just about any woman. I became uneasy. This couldn't be happening. Grace cried again. Daddy, I'm so sorry. I did it. I started sleeping with him. I wanted to prove that anything Mommy could do, I could do better. She could have had Carlton Morrison for a lover, but I took him away from her. And I succeeded, Papa, but I paid my price. He made me do terrible things that I'm ashamed of even now. There were other men and women and— Stop! I shouted. I don't want to hear any more. I don't want to know. Then the energy left me like air from a punctured balloon, and I collapsed back onto the couch. Grace was sleeping with her mother's lover. Grace saw my hesitation and drew the wrong conclusion. Dad, he may have been shit, but at least he was honorable. He put me in this house and helped me get a job. He also paid all the bills for Susie's labor and her medical bills since then. How generous of him, I grinned. He paid you to keep your head down and cover his sin. Grace sat up, leaning back in her chair. Now you know why I couldn't come home, Dad. I knew you would hate me, but not as much as I hate myself, she sobbed. I thought about how she had lived all this time with guilt and self-loathing and realized that she was just as much a victim as I was. As I hugged her, I realized what I needed to do. I stood up. It's getting late, Grace. It's been a traumatic day for both of us. I need to go back to the motel and get some sleep. She tried to stop me. Daddy, can't you sleep here tonight? I can move Susie into my room and you can put a bed in there. I know she'll be happy to see you when she wakes up. I gave her a forced smile. I wouldn't think of bothering Susie. You guys go to bed. I'll be fine at the motel. She rushed over to me and hugged me like she didn't want to let go. I missed you, Daddy. I really did. She pulled away to look into my eyes. I love you, Daddy. And no matter what, you'll always be my daddy. I hugged her back. Despite everything that had happened today, it felt wonderful to be reunited with my lost daughter. As I headed for the door, she grabbed my hand. Daddy, you're not going to do anything crazy, are you? I smiled at her. Terry asked me the same thing. I promised him I wouldn't, and I promise you the same. Then I headed for the exit. Sometimes good parents have to lie to their children. When I checked into my motel room, I was exhausted, but the revelations of the day kept me awake. I wished I could talk to our priest at home, because I really needed someone to whom I could spill all the horrors that had come over me. But there was no one in the motel room but me and those laughing gods who kept finding new blows for the hapless mortal. Turning around, I finally couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and turned on my iPad. I then began searching for information on Carlton Morrison, the antagonist who had stolen my wife, my daughter, and now my granddaughter. There was plenty of information about the man whom some disgruntled English journalist had dubbed the Playboy of the Midwest. Morrison, I learned, had inherited his original fortune from his father. But unlike the sons of many rich men, Carlton was very successful. After receiving a portion of his inheritance, he studied the commodities market on his own. Then, through a series of shrewd but bold moves, he managed to double his father's money during one of the periodic bubbles that occurred in the commodities arena. Of course, his fortune was not on the scale of Bill Gates, but he was a very rich man nonetheless. Then, as if guided by some sixth sense, he cashed out, leaving thousands of other investors holding the bag when the bubble inevitably burst. There was talk of an investigation, but as far as I can tell, nothing came of it. Instead, the young multimillionaire turned his attention to the art world, becoming a major patron of the arts and dating the most attractive women in the public eye. Stories of parties at his Chicago mansion became legend, and gossip about his romantic exploits filled the pages of a dozen tabloids. But I noted with interest that there were very few recent entries, and finally found a group of articles with an explanation. It turned out that a year ago, the Playboy had suffered a stroke and retired from the public stage. This news gladdened my heart. Indeed, it gave me hope. In his weakened state, I thought, it would be easier for me to take revenge. And revenge, if I am not mistaken, was what I wanted to accomplish. This man had done indescribable harm to me and my family, and I wasn't going to let him go unpunished. Today's revelations were like a series of hammer blows, each one dropping me lower and lower in a spiral until I felt that killing him was the only way to end the pain. I knew I wouldn't escape punishment for such a crime, but I didn't care. How can you punish someone who is already dead? At least I would have the satisfaction of knowing that I had taken him with me. And I already knew how to do it. My daughter had inadvertently shown me the way. I went back to bed and waited for sleep to come. Now that I had made the commitment, it seemed to me that my determination would surely bring the rest I so desperately needed. However, I found that I still could not fall asleep. Instead, I kept thinking about a quote that had occurred to me that day. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first drive mad. Is this really my destiny? Had I already reached the point of insanity? Should I have taken that final step to kill? After all, after that, there would be no redemption, no turning back. Was I destined to end my life this way, a pawn in some Olympic game? Or did I have another way? I lay there for a long time pondering these eternal questions, and then I fell asleep. Waking up the next morning, I felt strangely refreshed. Perhaps this is how making a final decision happens. Whatever the reason, it was good that I had time to rest, for I had a lot of preparation ahead of me. I worked all morning, stopping only to eat a little when my stomach protested. By the time I finished my preparations, it was noon. I gathered my things and headed to the front desk to check out. There was a manager on duty behind the counter, and as he was processing my bill, he obviously noticed my original reservation. "We didn't expect you to leave early, Mr. Moore. Are you happy with everything?" I smiled at him. "Oh yes, everything has been just fine." He thought he saw an opportunity for repeat business. "Then can I help you make reservations for your next visit?" "No," I said, "I'll never be here again." I saw the puzzled look on his face as I turned and walked away. The drive south from Skokie was pleasant enough. The traffic on the roads was not as heavy as it usually was on Sunday. It gave me a chance to think about the women in my life. Maddie's infidelity shook me to the core. How could she say she'd always loved me when she'd had affairs over the years? And then there was Grace. I could understand the stress that made her run away, but I couldn't understand how she could become the mistress of a man who seduced her own mother. And then there was poor little Susie, the only real innocence. But she too had fallen victim to the unholy relationship between her mother and this man. This man. I kept coming back to Carlton Morrison. I realized that he was my mortal enemy, my family's enemy, and the real antagonist in this drama. I had to deal with him. If I didn't, our wounds would never heal. This knowledge brought me a strange sense of calm. When you get to the point where there's only one thing left to do, it's comforting. The Morrison Mansion was located in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago. When I finally found it, I couldn't help but be impressed. The mansion was huge, with a stone and iron wall girdling a huge lot. The building was 3 stories high, clad in gray stone and topped with turrets and loopholes. It looked more like a fortress than a house. There were no parking spaces on the street, so I parked in front of a fire hydrant. What did I care if my car was towed away? The main entrance was protected by a heavy steel gate. Instead of swinging open, they rolled to the side. I noticed a steel beam reinforcing the center of the gate. No one was going to force their way through it. My plan was simple. I took Grace's example. She had been able to infiltrate his lair by taking advantage of both Morrison's curiosity and his vanity. I intended to use those same weaknesses to breach the wall of his castle. I walked over to the speaker next to the gate and pressed a button. A voice inquired why I was here. "I'm here to meet Carlton Morrison," I said confidently, looking directly into the closed-circuit television camera, watching me. "What is the nature of your business?" the voice asked coldly. "I'm an old friend of Madeline Moore's. I brought Mr. Morrison the latest gift from Maddie. Tell him Madeline Moore sent me. He'll remember her." There was a long pause, and I was beginning to think my confidence unfounded, but then the voice spoke again. "Please walk down the driveway to the front entrance. You will be met there." At that moment, the massive gate began to slowly roll back until it opened wide enough for me to pass through safely. As soon as I did, the gate reversed direction and closed with a metallic clang. As I approached the front door, the door swung open and a servant greeted me. "Who should I tell that Mr. Morrison summons you, sir?" she asked politely. "My name is Riley," I answered. I then waited while she went to notify her master. The front hallway she passed through had a spiral staircase. She opened the heavy double doors under the curve of the staircase and disappeared inside. While I waited, I looked up. The ornate carved staircase was massive and stretched a full 3 stories up. As I looked down, the housekeeper reappeared beside me. "Mr. Morrison will see you in his study, sir, if you will follow me." With these words, she led me toward the double doors from which she had just emerged. As we passed under the stairs, I thought, so this is what is below. The room we entered was oak-paneled and dark. Even the huge leaded glass windows were insufficient to light the place. Sitting at a mahogany desk in front of the largest window was a man with a face I recognized from photos I'd seen online. The most distinctive feature of his face was a full head of brown hair, slicked back over his forehead. Surely women like to run their fingers through it, I thought. The housekeeper turned to leave, closing the heavy doors behind her. As I approached the table, he stood awkwardly and reached across the table to shake mine. Come in, old boy," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't come out to meet you. I had a stroke a year ago and now I don't get around so well anymore." I was amused by his English accent. From his biography, it appeared that his family had come from Ireland during the potato famine. Oh well, I thought, the rich must have their little idiosyncrasies. Taking a closer look at him, I thought I could detect signs of a stroke. His left arm seemed to hang somewhat loosely, and the left side of his face seemed to have sagged a bit more than age usually dictates. Nevertheless, he was still a handsome man, and one could see how he could attract women even if he wasn't rich. "So you're an old friend of Maddie's," he continued. "It's a shame she's dead. She was a beautiful, intelligent woman. I miss her very much. I wish I could come to her funeral, but with the stroke and everything." He shrugged and smiled. I gritted my teeth as I watched him spout platitudes, but held my tongue. I'd have my turn. He seemed bothered by my silence, and after a moment he spoke again. "I understand you have something Maddie wanted me to pick up, is that correct?" When I only nodded, he continued. "It's like her to always think of others. She's always been like that, don't you know?" Reflecting on what I had learned over the weekend, I wondered if Maddie had really stopped thinking about others. Perhaps that wasn't fair. But if she did stop thinking, it was only after she'd already done what she wanted to do, I thought bitterly. He cleared his throat. What exactly do you have for me from her? Perhaps some sort of souvenir or letter? No, I replied. Nothing like that, just a simple message. When I paused, he began to show impatience. Then what is it? I bent over the table so that my face was a foot from his. Just this, I said emphatically. Screw you. He threw his chair back in surprise and alarm. Hey, he sighed. What's that? Then a strange expression appeared on his face, and he growled, Who are you anyway? I noticed that his English accent was gone. I already told your housekeeper, I said evenly, but I think she misunderstood me. My name is Riley, Riley Moore. He flinched when he heard me. Then you must be Maddie. So you were. That's right, I cut him short. I'm Maddie's husband, the cuckold you thought you'd cheated for so many years. Only now I'm here, and it's time for you to pay for what you've done. His face turned pale, and he looked wildly around. His left hand tried to reach for the buzzer built into his desk, but the movements were jerky and slow. Don't even think about calling for help, I told him quickly. I could be at this desk long before anyone gets here. He jerked his hand away. What are you going to do, Moore? Destroy me? Over a little affair that happened a long time ago? Do you really want to spend the rest of your life in prison just because your wife left you a few times? No, adultery would probably not be enough for that, I replied. But the fact that you got my wife pregnant might whet my appetite, and the fact that I unwittingly raised your child as my daughter would certainly add to my motivation. And then there's you. Putting it all together, a life sentence doesn't seem so dire to me. As I listed my claims, Morrison became more and more agitated. Sweat began to trickle down his forehead and into his eyes. I leaned over his desk again. When I went to bed last night, I planned to destroy you tonight. But this morning I came up with a better idea. I'm going to let you live so you can experience all the pain, grief, and horror I went through. His voice was a hoarse whisper. What are you going to do? It's simple, I said. I'm going to ruin you. When I leave here, I'm going straight to the police to issue a warrant for your arrest. But a man of your fortune can buy off that sort of thing, so I'm not going to take any chances. As soon as I get out of police headquarters, I'll go to the editorial office of the Sun-Times and tell them the whole sordid story. As soon as I'm done, I'm going to contact every tabloid and gossip columnist who's ever written about you and let them know what a rotter you really are. When I'm done, you'll have to brick up the iron gate in front of your house because every blogger in the world will be eager to find dirt on you. As for your friends in the art world, when they find out what you've done, I bet they won't touch you within 10 feet. They'll probably publish your picture and post guards so you can't even walk through the doors of their museums. You'll go from being a patron of the arts to a social outcast, a leper, shunned and reviled. As I spoke, Morrison sank lower and lower in his chair. It was evident that he was envisioning the fate I was predicting, and when I finished, he visibly shuddered. Suddenly, his right hand darted to the side and opened one of the drawers of his desk. Slipping his hand inside, he pulled out a 9mm pistol, which he pointed at my chest. You're an even bigger fool than I thought, Moore, he growled. What's stopping me from shooting you right now before you can tell your story to the whole world? All I have to do is say you threatened me, and I was forced to defend myself. I won't even lie. I stood up straight. Go ahead and shoot me, Morrison, be my guest. After what you did to me and my family, I'm already dead. My answer caught him off guard and he hesitated. But before you do, I want you to realize that shooting me won't do you any good, I continued. I sent the whole story to my lawyer at home this morning. If he doesn't hear back from me by noon, I've instructed him to give all the facts to the Chicago police and then go to the Sun-Times and all the other media. Your name will be dragged so deeply into the mud that you'll never be able to wash yourself clean. And there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. But what about Grace? What about my granddaughter? He pleaded. You're condemning them to the same fate as me, and you don't want that. My daughter, your daughter, already hates herself because she feels guilty for what she's done. Telling the truth is the only way I know of to help her forgive herself. And as for poor little Susie, I doubt very much that her name or picture will ever make the news. Even if it did, the poor unfortunate child would probably never know about it, much less care. You've already done all you can do to us, Morrison. You can't hurt us any more than you already have. The only thing left for you to do is to join us in the hell you've created. But I have money, he exclaimed. Lots of money. I can make you a very rich man if you just forget about all this. I grinned. Your money won't give me back the love you took from my wife. They won't give me back the daughter I should have had or the granddaughter I never even knew I had. Your money means nothing to me." As I stared at him, he slowly lowered the gun to the table. He looked at me with hunted eyes and couldn't say anything. I turned to walk away. I heard movement behind me, and when I looked over my shoulder, I saw him raise the machine gun again. I just kept walking. If he was going to shoot me, it was going to be in the back. "We'll see how he explains it to the police," I grinned to myself. I reached the door and opened it without looking back. Nothing had happened. I crossed the threshold and closed the door behind me. The housekeeper was already waiting. "Are you leaving, Mr. Riley?" "Yes," I replied. "I've done everything I had to do." As I was leaving the front door, the large steel gates began to roll back, and I started walking toward them. I was almost to them when I heard a single gunshot coming from behind the gray walls. I continued walking, and incredibly my car was parked right where I had left it. I pulled away from the curb, got behind the wheel, and rolled down the windows to let fresh air into the car. Maybe it would get rid of the stench of decadence and perversion that lingered behind me from that dark room under the stairs. As I drove, I thought about what had happened. I knew that mortals couldn't surpass the gods, but at least I hadn't taken that final step toward murder and madness either. And then another thought hit me. What if I wasn't the main character in this drama at all? Maybe Morrison had been the god's target all along, not me. If that was the case, I didn't know whether to be relieved or outraged. In the end, I decided it didn't matter. Either way, the play was finally coming to an end. When I arrived in Skokie, I had to drive past the little park where Grace and Susie and I had walked the day before. As I looked out the side window, I saw a little boy who had climbed to the top of the spiral slide, but was now sitting on it, afraid to come down. I stopped to watch. His mom was standing at the bottom of the slide. "It's okay," she said. "You can go down." He looked at her with widened eyes, then seemed to make a decision and, releasing her grip, slid down the ramp. Sure enough, as he neared the end, his movement slowed until he came to a stop at the bottom. He looked triumphantly at his mother and then hurried to the stairs to start climbing again. I smiled and started the car again. I was ready to get started too. Grace must have been looking through the curtains because she opened the door before I could ring the bell. She jumped out and hugged me. "Daddy, I was so worried about you. I tried to call, but you wouldn't pick up. I was sure something had happened to you." I smiled at the irony of her words, but didn't say anything. Instead, I put my arm around her waist and walked with her into the house. "You need to get ready, Susie," I told her. "I'll take you home." Epilogue. I didn't fool Morrison. I had emailed the whole story to my lawyer that morning. But when I heard on the radio that wealthy philanthropist Carlton Morrison had been found dead in his home from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, I told my lawyer to leave the documents alone. Morrison's suicide was sufficient atonement for his sins, it seemed to me. But I wasn't done with Mr. Morrison yet. The profligate had no wife or will, so naturally his relatives became furious at the prospect of dividing his estate. Imagine their horror when my attorney submitted Grace's DNA test. Under Illinois law, if a person has a descendant who dies but no spouse, the entire estate goes to that descendant. Morrison dealt a terrible blow to my family, but when the final curtain fell, I was the only one left on the stage. What's more, I managed to preserve my life and sanity, as well as recover the remnants of my family. And perhaps most importantly, I knew that my precious granddaughter would never be deprived of the care and treatment she might need for the rest of her life. That was enough for me. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.